And now we're about to hear from Alex Wisson, who's a social researcher and independent journalist, and who is a former PhD candidate, well versed in a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today, and understands neoliberalism in many ways that others don't. Alex, you've watched the segment, the program today. What's your views about these powerful elites behind the central banking system?
Well, it's been a very stimulating discussion, Gerry, but one area that I would like to explore that hasn't been brought up so far is that we're not simply talking about the power of banks in isolation. The banks play an absolutely instrumental role in locking together corporate power more generally. You mentioned earlier the huge amount of tax evasion that takes place, offshore bank accounts, not just simply in countries like the Cayman Islands and Nauru and in secret Swiss banks, but throughout the banking network generally. There was a study done a couple of years ago by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and the Tax Justice Network that found that as much as $32 trillion of corporate money is nestled away, is ferreted away in these offshore bank accounts. Now, significantly, this study also found that some of the key banking institutions, some of the world's 50 biggest banks, were a part of this crime. Really, I don't think there's any way of describing it, of allowing corporations, facilitating corporate tax evasion. And in many ways, these banking institutions are invested in big corporations like Toyota, like News Corporation, and so forth. They have shares in these companies. They have banking directors on the boards of these companies. And that's one of the other ways in which they influence economic policy. So it's not simply through, as you say, the setting of interest rates, control of the money supply. It's actually having a direct interest in corporations.
So you're talking about shadowy elites, powerful citadels of monopolies, small monopolies but powerful, that have actually tied up the economical affairs of the world with other capital, political, economic, intellectual, and the military-industrial complex, the whole lot, that they're intertwined.
Absolutely, they're all interlocked at the very highest levels of power. And look, I think this area is obviously very complex. It's difficult for your viewers to get their heads around the world of finance. But in some ways, it's very simple. And I think it's important that your viewers appreciate the sheer scale of some of the institutions we're talking about. And we're not simply talking about banks per se and central banks, but also the big investment houses like Berkshire Hathaway, led by the second richest person in the world, Warren Buffett, who's estimated to be worth $72 billion. Colossal institutions like JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs. Now, we're talking here about institutions that have hundreds of billions of dollars of capital assets under management. And I think that allows your viewers to appreciate the amount of economic activity that they influence and control. And we saw that in the 2008 financial crisis, when famously the US Congress in the last few months of the Bush administration passed the so-called Troubled Asset Relief Program, $700 billion to these banks. They remain unregulated, they remain unaccountable, and they remain very much firmly with the leaders of the institutions of our economy.
On that note, Alex, what hope do we actually have? As I put to Dr. Abigail Bray and Colin Penter, what hope do we actually have? We can argue, for instance, the Occupy movement as an example. In order to smash that Occupy movement in the United States, 700 people were arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge, Occupy protesters. 8,000 were arrested in the 1 year, and that broke the spirit of the American Spring, of the Occupy movement. Is there any real hope? Is there any real hope that we can actually challenge this, what you're describing, in effect, a neoliberal, neo-fascist system?
Well, you're talking there about the Arab Spring. Let's not forget the American Spring. Let's not forget the Arab Spring a few years ago as well. I mean, historians are already talking about 2011 as the year of revolts, rebellions, and revolutions. Now, things have deteriorated in many ways with what's happened in the Arab world, but one can go through the list of the social revolts, rebellions that have taken place throughout the world, from the Gezi Park movement in Turkey to Occupy, there was actually a big workers' revolt in Bosnia that didn't get much coverage. All of these social revolts are connected because in one way or another they are directed to. We've only
got a minute left, Alex, and I'd like to ask you a quick question. Central banks are powerful entities that do actually supply money which they loan at interest. They are possibly the greatest benefactors of war. And for instance, the First World War. The Rockefellers made $20 million at that time. The central banks loaned $30 billion. Are these benefactors also the people who craft these wars to accumulate resources?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, famously, some of your viewers may know that the Rothschild banking house is said to have financed all sides of the French Revolutionary Wars. Britain, Prussia, and France were all in one way or another dependent on the Rothschild banking house. And again, I stress this point of interlocking, that clearly if you are in a position to control the money supply, weapons cost money. It's not simply those weapons manufacturers themselves, although they play a pivotal role as well and obviously profit greatly from the wars around the world. There's various interests involved, but just if I could just briefly mention Greece in this context, that I think that demonstrates very clearly the power that these banking institutions do have.
Alex, we're going to have you back on. We've actually got to go to a commercial break, but it was powerful listening to you, and we will have you back on. Thank you, Alex.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Gerry.
During the last Great Depression, a game was invented called Monopoly. Now think about it for a second, because Monopoly, nobody works at Monopoly. You just sit around the board game, and the bank gives you everybody a bunch of money. And then they give you a piece to chase around the board. Every time you pass go, you get more money. There's quantitative easing. There's quantitative easing every time you pass go. And it's a real estate speculation game. And in the end, there's one person, after being a rent-seeking, rent-charging oligarch, ends up with all of the properties. Everyone else is bled dry, no matter the fact that they were getting money the whole time. The quantitative easing was being paid out the whole time. The asset price inflation of those houses and hotels on the Monopoly board reached astronomical levels, bankrupting the entire board. There's only one winner in the game of Monopoly, and this is exactly what we see in today's Western economies and economies around the world. It's free money from the Fed. People get a free entree through their credit card or whatever means. They race around these boards over and over again, but only one winner. And that winner usually, as we now know, is because they have engaged not with the luck of the dice, but more in terms of the kleptocratic overtures made surreptitiously to a corrupt and venal political class, whether it's Osborne here in the UK or Wall Street bankers.